of Worship, your source for commentary and discussion on worship, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones.
Well, hello and welcome to the Act of Worship podcast. This is Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones. Thank you for joining me today. This is my at least monthly episode that I am doing. This is the episode for March. And this is a topic that we probably think about and at least discuss to some degree as Christians. In 2 Corinthians 10:5, the Apostle Paul contends that we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. And this is in his second letter to the church at Corinth. And in context, Paul was defending his ministry against false prophets by highlighting the difference between worldly wisdom and spiritual wisdom of the cross, which to humankind could seem illogical or even foolish, as it says in 1 Corinthians 1:18. And Paul's letter to the Corinthians seemingly doubles down on his argument against false prophets, which he initiates in 1 Corinthians. In other words, the apostle feels that he must further oppose worldly wisdom, which has infiltrated the church. And this sentiment resonates with the church today, especially the church here in the West, in the United States. But the key to Paul's instructions is to take every thought obedient or every thought captive to obey Christ. In other words, this action is foundational to the battle that is waged against lofty or worldly opinions. Without taking thoughts captive, it is impossible to defeat the enemy. The mind is a powerful tool and may either be used for good or evil, which is why Paul says in his letter to the Romans that God's people are transformed by the renewing of the mind in Romans 12:2. So when the Bible teaches that the greatest commandment is to love God with all the heart, with all the soul, the mind, and the strength in Mark 12:30, the mind is crucial to obedience. If the heart is the seed or the core of a person, the mind is the root. And so how one cares for the mind impacts all other areas of life. So what does it mean to take your thoughts captive? I'm going to give you three imperatives here. 1, fight for the rule of the mind. 2, destroy the enemy's attacks on the mind. And 3, obey Christ. And all of these aspects are rooted in the realization that worship is war. That's the connection to worship here. War is waged against the enemy when God's people worship. So the first imperative, fight for the rule of the mind. Captive is a militaristic term. Take the mind captive. And the idea that Paul gives is to fight for control or rule of the mind. The mind is perhaps one of the most powerful internal tools of any person, and it's often the root of action or inaction. And Paul uses language in the same chapter that suggests that Christians are in a fierce battle and we need to wage war against the enemy. And part of doing so is to fight for rule of the mind, because if believers don't fight for control of the mind, other forces, namely evil, will absolutely control the mind, resulting in evil decisions. And so one's actions are derived from what he or she deposits into the mind. So speaking to myself, perhaps more than anyone, we must not only guard our hearts, but also our minds against corruption that could potentially destroy us, which is often insidious enough through the external forces around us. For example, music, movies, videos, language, positive or negative thoughts. In other words, how you think about things. These certainly impact our worldview. And so rule of the mind is seemingly neglected by people as if it's not a serious issue. But the mind must be renewed because transformation begins with the renewal of the mind. And so to take thoughts captive, God's people need to fight. In other words, wage war for rule of the mind, and namely the rule of Christ, not of ourselves. Second imperative, destroy the enemy's attacks on the mind. So Peter instructs believers to continuously be prepared and to give a defense of the faith in 1 Peter 3:15. This instruction is stalwartly linked to the spiritual warfare of all believers. Keep in mind, we're in a battle. We are in a battle. And we must always be prepared. And so taking the thoughts captive also means destroying the enemy's attacks on the mind, which is accomplished by not only monitoring what enters the mind, but also utilizing the godly material given to us for fighting against evil and false arguments. In other words, be prepared to give a logical defense of the faith. God does not call his people to inadequacy or incompetence by lack of involvement in this spiritual war that we're in, but to participate by preparation. So preparation doesn't mean just being ready, but it also means employing the mind for skillful communication, which takes work. We might think, oh, so-and-so is naturally better at that than me. It takes work. Said another way, no believer holds the excuse of incompetence as if only the most intelligent and eloquent should face the task of defense. Everybody is given that task. And so finding a professing Christian who creates a negative perception because of an inability to give a thorough and well-formed argument for the faith, that's not difficult. Many professing Christians are that way. But part of the reason is that so many professing Christians live lives that do not look any different from the rest of the world. All believers in the process of sanctification have moments of failure, but those moments don't help in the task of destroying lofty arguments against the faith. So a significant part of destroying the enemy's attacks is living a life that coincides with the argument presented. And upon that action, then, God's people must know and understand foundational elements of the faith, so that these lofty and these well-presented arguments against the faith will fall. So to take our thoughts captive is to destroy the attacks of the enemy. In other words, utilize the righteous material offered to the mind for spiritual battle. The third imperative, obey Christ. And so this is in continuation of the idea of a life compatible with a righteous mind. Taking thoughts captive should ensue in obedience, which effectively punishes disobedience. So after instructing the Corinthians to take the thoughts captive, he says to be ready to punish disobedience when obedience is complete. 2 Corinthians 10:6. And it's only at that point that disobedience is punished. Prior to complete obedience, punishment of disobedience is not possible, which further highlights the link between lifestyle and the mind. Paul understands the necessity of Christ's rule over the mind. Believers need to intentionally take every thought captive so that the trash trying to enter is filtered out and destroyed, and the righteous that enters is kept and utilized. Now, keep in mind, the righteous, the material that enters our mind that is good, needs to not only be kept but to be utilized. We're in a war. Use the weapons we are given. Obedience to Christ begins with the mind, and yet in a cyclical manner continues to feed the mind. In other words, the more Christ rules the mind, the more we obey Christ, and the more we obey Christ, the more the mind is renewed. So taking our thoughts captive equates to obedience to Christ. Worship is war. And so the mind is connected to worship because our spiritual act of worship is rooted in the renewing of the mind. Again, Romans 12:1 and 2. We present our bodies as living sacrifices. We are transformed by the renewal of our mind, and this is our spiritual act of worship. And when God's people worship not only corporately but personally, the enemy is defeated. So worship is a constant pummeling of Satan. Christians are in a daily battle, and worship is the sure and spiritual defeat. Without worship, Satan would constantly defeat God's people. But when Christians worship God, Satan is defeated and God is exalted. And so since the rule of the mind is a perpetual battle, believers should understand that taking thoughts captive is necessary for effective worship. And then again, in a cyclic manner, worship is enhanced and the mind continues to be renewed. Forces of good and evil are at war for rule of the mind. God's people are at war with evil. So Christ must control the mind and God's people must worship because worship is war waged against the enemy. And so to take thoughts captive is for Christ to rule the mind and God's people to worship in an unrelenting battle, which God ultimately wins. So we as believers must take our thoughts captive. We are in a battle. Taking our thoughts captive means that we are engaged in the war and in the battle. I hope this has been helpful. As I always do, these topics I discuss most often you can find a connection, a link to Christian worship. And that's why this podcast is the act of worship. The way we live our lives, what we put in our mind, this is our act of worship. So hopefully this has been helpful and beneficial to you. Thank you for listening today to the Act of Worship podcast. This is Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones.